Hey, what's up? I had a little story I thought was cool. If you're feeling beat down by just life, maybe this will help a little bit. Also, if I keep looking up there, it's because I'm reading my notes. I'm not good at this. Anyway, my son's really into history, so I was reading about it. By the winter of 1944, the tide of World War II had largely turned decisively. Just months prior, a couple months in June on D-Day, Allied forces had landed in Normandy, France, eventually liberating France, marching through Belgium, and were knocking on the door of Germany itself. And at that point, pushing like November, December, Hitler and his generals could sense that the end of the war in Europe was near. So Hitler devised this very aggressive and risky plan. Many of his own generals really believed it was a terrible idea and just completely unrealistic, but he overruled them. His idea was to strike at the Allied forces in the dead of winter, using surprise weather and just sheer force to attempt to overwhelm the Allied troops. So the German troops used winter camouflage and attacked through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed would probably be difficult terrain for a major assault. And on December 16th, 1944, just days before Christmas, Hitler launched the offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. It became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces, I believe, in World War II. So Hitler's plan was twofold. First, he believed that if he hit the Allied forces hard enough, he could demoralize them. They'd been away from their families for, at this point, years. It was the dead of winter. Christmas was just days away, and he believed that exhaustion and discouragement might force a negotiated peace in the West, and that the Allies would settle for the ground they'd already gained back rather than push for total victory. Second, he believed that if the German forces could break through the Allied front, they might split the Allied armies, seize key supply lines, and throw the entire Western Front into chaos. But the Allied lines did not break in the Battle of the Bulge. They bent, that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge, but they held. And what strikes me as incredible is this: the soldiers who served and fought in the Battle of the Bulge had no idea how close they were to the finish line. The Battle of the Bulge took place about 94% of the way through the war in Europe. Victory was only months away. By the end of April, only 4 months later, just a few months after the Battle of the Bulge had ended, Hitler would be dead, Germany would fall, concentration camps would be liberated, and the war in Europe would be over. But during the Battle of the Bulge, the soldiers didn't know any of that. All they knew was that it was winter. They were exhausted, they were cold. The German attack was overwhelming. The odds felt enormous, and on some level, it probably felt like all they were doing was playing defense, and still they held the line. There's something incredible about that kind of courage. They didn't endure because they knew how the story would end. They endured even when the end wasn't visible, and even when the odds seemed impossible and looked overwhelming. And I think there's something in that for all of us. I think sometimes what feels like failure is actually endurance. Sometimes what feels like being stuck is actually faithfulness and resolve. And sometimes when it feels like all you're doing is playing defense, you're not losing ground at all. You're absorbing the enemy's last desperate push. I can relate to that a little bit. Over the past 15 months or so, I've had 4 facial surgeries. Um, I'm actually down a couple teeth. Check that out. I had a bone infection that took them basically. And there were moments where every time I felt like I could finally like take a breath, get my head above water, another hit came. Like the battle just wouldn't end. And I wasn't advancing, I wasn't gaining ground, I wasn't making progress, I was just hanging on. And the curveballs have continued to come. But I've learned that sometimes faith doesn't look like moving forward all the time. Sometimes it looks like just enduring and hanging on. Sometimes it looks like standing long enough for the enemy to exhaust himself. The Allied front in the Battle of the Bulge didn't advance, it just held. And that holding, the refusal to break, is what ultimately broke the back of the German offensive. And from that point on, the end of the war was inevitable, even if it wasn't immediate. In Ephesians, Paul tells us to take up the shield of faith, and with it, he says we can extinguish the flaming arrows of the enemy. Sometimes what feels merely like defense, just hanging on, is actually stripping the enemy of the ammunition he's trying to use against you. If it feels like you're just playing defense, if you're tired of hanging on, don't assume that you're losing. Defense doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes it means you're bearing through the enemy's last throes of desperation. Sometimes it means the hardest part is almost over. And sometimes it means victory is closer than you think, even if you can't see it. So hold the line. Victory may be closer than you think. Thanks.